London, September the 25th, 2020. The murder of Sergeant Matt Ratana makes headlines around the world. The Metropolitan Police officer is murdered inside a London police station by 26-year-old Louis de Zoysa.
I was in absolute shock. And one of the thoughts in my head was, how could I have given birth to a child like this? And is there something in me that turned him into this or put him on this path?
The shooting of Sergeant Matt Ratana was covered in newspapers and magazines, including Best. The shooting of a police officer shocked Britain, and the question on everyone's lips was, what sort of family did de Zoysa come from? And what would the ripple effect be on that family? Until that moment, de Zoysa's mother, Elizabeth, had worried about her son's autism, but never dreamed he would turn into a murderer. Now, for the first time, Elizabeth de Zoysa recalls what happened that day and shares disturbing footage of her son, who suffered brain damage in the incident.
He had a 1% chance of surviving. We didn't know that. I just can't explain the shock. The shock that went through me. How in the world had he been allowed to get a gun into a custody suite?
We delve into the murder to find out what led to Louis de Zoysa wandering the streets of London with a gun. Was it inevitable that he would become a killer? Or were police failings to blame for the tragedy, which has devastated the lives of both Sergeant Ratana and de Zoysa's families? Louis de Zoysa grew up in a large family in South London, with his mum Elizabeth a translator and father Channa a teacher.
I didn't have any experience or expectations of what having a boy would be. I noticed a few things, that he was not a stereotypical boy. He could get very engrossed in a task. In one way, he was a very easy child to look after because he could lose himself in a task like that and be completely content.
At school, a young Louis struggled to make friends. Other children picked on him for being different.
He was bullied, and then he would react, and then we would be called into the school because this was a problem, and we always felt that put us on the back foot because we knew that there was something wrong with Louis, that he couldn't cope with certain situations. So when he was at primary school, we'd pushed for the educational psychologist to see him. We knew that he was very bright, that was picked up on, but that he had attention problems. But I think because of his brightness, that compensated. He hardly had any friends at primary school. And Channa and myself started a cycling club. So we used to go cycling once a month with a group of other parents. And that was our way of socially engineering things so that Louis had friends. At least one Sunday in the month, we'd be out with other children from his school.
There are around 700,000 people with autism in the UK. Each has their own strengths and weaknesses, but attacking a stranger is extremely rare. So what was it that turned this intelligent little boy, who was so loved by his family, into a killer?
On the one hand, because a lot of the time when we'd been called into school, I always felt that the finger of blame had been pointed at us, and especially at me as his mum, that I hadn't set appropriate boundaries and that I wasn't able to parent him properly.
Autism meant that de Zoysa sometimes felt overwhelmed by situations and could go into meltdown.
We'd had some incidents where he would come home and he would break things if there was an argument, if people were talking too loudly, if perhaps he hadn't eaten on time, and who knows what had happened during the day when he was at school. And I found that very, very upsetting and challenging.
Meltdowns can happen when someone who has autism becomes completely overwhelmed by their current situation and temporarily loses behavioural control. Sensing Louis might be autistic, his mother took courses on how to deal with the potential reason for his behaviour.
Which was all about a low arousal approach and about preempting situations before they happened. So after that, his behaviour was fine. He was a very affectionate boy. He still is, very loving, very, very kind.
Once Louis was diagnosed with autism in his teens, Elizabeth thought life would improve for him, but the reality was very different.
You get the diagnosis and then you get a pack of material and the material of all the resources and places that you can go to. But because autism is a lifelong condition, you basically get the diagnosis and that's it. You're left to your own devices.
Louis de Zoysa was a high achiever academically, gaining 3 A's at A-level, and went on to study mechanical engineering at University College London, but he soon dropped out. Realising he'd quit university, Elizabeth encouraged her son to apply for the civil service.
He got through the first hurdle, and there was probably from April to September, he had to go through more tests and vetting. And I thought the civil service would be great for him, because I'd always thought if he went to a job day in, day out, he'd be with other people, neurotypical people, and that would keep him safe, because I felt he needed to be kept safe. If he wasn't at home, he wouldn't be safe.
De Zoysa started work in the civil service as a data analyst at HMRC, the tax office, and 2 years later, at Christmas 2019, he moved out of his childhood home.
But he used to come backwards and forwards anyway until about March. By March, he'd had so many arguments with his dad, and he'd had an argument with me. So he'd made it clear that he didn't really want me to contact him. So I had his number, I WhatsApped him a couple of times, but he never replied. I was really worried, but I thought he was still going to his job.
What Elizabeth didn't realise was that, like so many workers, her son had been furloughed during the pandemic.
So he was in his flat the whole time on his own, which was the worst thing possible for him.
London, September the 25th, 2020. As the world emerges from the first lockdown, de Zoysa is out walking the streets of London at night, and for reasons that only he knew, carrying a gun. He's bought this legally on the internet, as it's an antique and used obsolete bullets, but he has made some of his own. In the early hours of the morning, Louis de Zoysa is stopped on London Road, Norbury, South London, and searched by police officers. Under UK law, the police are allowed to stop and search if they have reasonable grounds to suspect someone is carrying illegal drugs, a gun, stolen goods, or something that could be used to commit a crime, such as a crowbar. Officers stopped de Zoysa, who's carrying a holdall, and explained to him that there had been burglaries in the area. De Zoysa initially asks the police to call his parents, and then admits to having a small amount of cannabis in his bag. He is polite and allows himself to be searched. Officers find homemade bullets. Tragically, and despite what appears to be a detailed search, they do not find the antique gun hidden in a holster. It's believed this was hidden under his armpit. De Zoysa is arrested for carrying bullets, which he's made himself out of casings and lead. He's placed in the back of a police van and taken to Croydon Custody Suite to be charged. At the custody suite, when Sergeant Matt Ratana enters his cell, de Zoysa pulls out the gun, firing at Sergeant Ratana at point-blank range. The first bullet hits Sergeant Ratana in the chest. He falls to the ground instantly. A second hits his leg. As de Zoysa is forced to the ground, a third hits the cell wall, and a fourth goes into de Zoysa's neck. Sergeant Matt Ratana is rushed to hospital, but tragically, his injuries prove fatal. It's 2:15 a.m. Meanwhile, Elizabeth is asleep and unaware her world is about to change forever, and it happens shortly after breakfast as she waved her younger children off to school.
I was just desperate to do some housework because the house was a complete mess. So I got the Hoover out and then I heard this really loud bang on the door. It was like someone had a mallet and was trying to break the door down. And it was bin day. So I just thought it was the bin men. I was in my dressing gown. I opened the door and I was pushed back by an officer. He pinned me back against the wall and put my arms, handcuffed me behind my back. And then about 10 or 12 officers streamed through. That's my husband, he was teaching yoga on a Zoom call at the back of the house. So they went to the back of the house And then I saw them, he'd been handcuffed behind his back as well. And I had no idea, obviously, what was happening. I was really in shock. And there were two plainclothes officers, a man and a woman. So then the man started to ask us questions about Louis. And it was just dread. I thought, what has he got himself into?
Elizabeth is about to find out that her son is a killer.
The first thing he asked was, does Louis have any disabilities that we need to know about? So I said he's got autism and he's got dyspraxia. He asked me what's dyspraxia, and I explained it's like clumsy child syndrome. And then they were asking us other questions about where did Louis work, when was the last time we'd seen him, what did he do for a living? And so Chana was answering those questions. I was just too shocked. It was very uncomfortable as well, just to be sat there with all these officers and the both of us handcuffed behind our backs. I think this probably went on for about an hour, and then the female officer, she got a phone call, and then she looked at us and she said, I've got something to tell you. Louis was arrested in the morning and he was taken to the custody suite at Windmill Road, and he had a gun and he shot dead a police officer and then turned the gun on himself. I just can't explain the shock that went through me. I swore, but part of me knew that this was just unbelievable. How in the world had he been allowed to get a gun into a custody suite? And I shouted at them, you've failed my son and you failed your colleague. And I saw their faces, and that I felt sorry. I did, and I apologised because I could see that they were shocked as well. To lose a colleague, it must be horrendous as well for them. I just curled over and just wanted to hide.
At this stage, Elizabeth had no idea the extent of her son's injuries.
What the police officer said, she said that Louis had received this gunshot wound to the neck, but it wasn't life-changing. So my immediate thought was just relief that he was okay. We did ask about going to see Louis, but that was definitely a no.
Across the world, people were waking up to the shocking news that Sergeant Matt Ratana, a popular police officer in the Met, had been shot dead in a police custody cell in London. A New Zealander by birth, he'd served in the Met for 30 years and was just 3 months away from his retirement. Elizabeth felt for his family and wondered if she was in some way to blame.
At that stage, I hadn't seen the CCTV and I was in absolute shock. And one of the thoughts in my head was, how could I have given birth to a child like this? And is there something in me that turned him into this or put him on this path? And I felt I felt a little bit of resentment towards the police as well, that they hadn't done the search properly. And that's not me. I don't feel resentment normally.
The shock news left Elizabeth asking herself many questions.
I just wanted to find out who I was, whether I was going to turn into this hard-bitten person who perhaps was, getting angry with other people about how this had happened. Obviously, I've changed in some ways, but the essence of who I am is still there.
In the hospital, doctors were saving de Zoysa's life, and his injuries were far more extensive and life-changing than Elizabeth could have imagined.
On the Monday, we went to St George's to try and see Louis. We went to the reception area and I spoke to the receptionist there, and then she called security. And they said that if I tried to go to the ward, I'd be arrested. They wouldn't let us see our son. No one explained to us how how serious it was. So I only learnt about 3 or 4 months ago that he had a 1% chance of surviving. In the end, we spoke to the priest at St George's, and he spoke to the consultant, and he arranged for the consultant to ring us once a week to give us an update on how Louis was doing. I was desperate to speak to the priest every day afterwards, just to find out, he lifted up a cup today, or, he might have eaten something. And they were just tiny details. And that was the highlight of my day.
Weeks passed and Elizabeth longed to see her son. Eventually, his lawyer recorded a video of him for the family. What Elizabeth saw left her deeply shocked.
Do you want to write it down?
So, I don't give the power.
Let me... Turning off and floating a birthday bouncy castle. Is that what you're talking about? No.
Yes, so Basilicas and the top. I don't get.
Okay, alright, no
So,
worries.
I used to, there's 2 things.
Right.
So, Basilicas and washing.
Okay. I know it's difficult, obviously, for you to say things, but is there anything you want to say to your parents and your family?
Yes, so.
Do you want a pen and paper?
Yes.
Whiteboard over.
It's okay. Look, leave it for now. I will be back at later on, and then you can, or another day, and then you would probably be in a better position to write, okay? All right, I'm going to turn off the tape now, okay?
My name's Emma Cunningham, and I'm here really to give my perspective as a criminologist, looking a little bit more deeply into the perpetrator of this crime is important in this case, because I don't think his own personal situation, his neurodiversity, was taken into account when being treated by professionals within the criminal justice system. The stop and search might have impacted more on him than on anyone else that might have been stopped without those diagnosis of autism.
Despite his clear disabilities, Louis de Zoysa was deemed fit to stand trial and charged with murder. In the lead up to the trial, for the first time, Elizabeth decided to watch the CCTV footage of her son killing Sergeant Ratana.
The barrister had given us the opportunity to watch it quite a few times, but I was just very, very scared. And then Channa watched it. I went with him. I sat outside the room while he watched it, and when he came out, he just put his head in his hands and he was crying. And then he was telling me things that Louis had asked for his parents when he was arrested. He encouraged me to watch it, and I knew that if I was going to the trial that it would be shown there, and I didn't want to watch it for the first time at the trial.
It's a question that any mother would ask themselves. If my child murdered someone, would I stand by them? Having watched the horrific CCTV footage of her son killing Sergeant Ratana, Elizabeth was in no doubt that she would stand by her son.
I felt sadness about what he'd done. Then I have to step back and think, and see it as the bigger picture. And I don't even want to dwell on how he got to that point. There must have been a process of how he got to that point. But I wanted to take the line with myself that I'm just taking it, that I'm his mum, I'm going to stand by him. It's almost like the deal when you have a child. You know, when you give birth to a child, no one says to you, you can only love your child if they go down this path and everything is perfect. And when we think about that as parents, we think about problems such as minor problems, perhaps arguments or fallouts, but this is something much more than that. And I thought, well, I wouldn't have abandoned him when he was a baby. I wouldn't do that now.
De Zoysa was deemed fit to plead, and in April 2023, he appeared via video link from hospital in a wheelchair to enter a not guilty plea to murder. He did this by holding up a whiteboard, which he uses to help him communicate. Trial began in June 2023 at Northampton Crown Court.
It was really important to me to attend. I wanted to go to be there to support Louis because I knew he'd be at the trial, and I think that he needed a familiar face just to be there. And I also felt that because Louis, obviously with his brain injury, he's got a very limited understanding of what has happened and the consequences for the victim's family. And in some way I felt if I was there, I'd be like a representative of Louis, and I'd be there sort of out of respect for the victim's family as well.
While Elizabeth was very aware that her son had taken a life and felt deeply for the Ratana family, she hoped the jury would accept the defence case that he was suffering from an autistic meltdown at the time of the killing and therefore was acting with diminished responsibility. But the jury found him guilty, and on 27th of July 2023, he was given a whole life sentence for murder, which he's currently serving in a high security prison. A whole life sentence means, unless it's overturned, he will never be released.
A sentence of imprisonment for life with a whole life order is a sentence of last resort. Expert evidence during the trial indicated that autism does not cause people to be violent. Autistic people are no more likely to commit violent offences than anyone else. Prior to being stopped by the police, I accept that you had no plan to murder a police officer. But once you had been stopped and detained, and the period thereafter, you did form a plan to do so. That plan took shape in a number of ways. You lied to the officers. You said you did not have anything that could hurt them. You told them that the cartridges that they found were not real. You pointed them in the direction of the cannabis in your bag, diverting their attention from your body where the gun was concealed. Louis de Zoysa, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. I impose a whole life order. That means you will remain in custody for the rest of your life.
I feel that the trial was really unfair, and that Louis should never have been found fit to plead, and that he should have got a hospital order.
While awaiting trial from the spring of 2021, Louis de Zoysa had been held at St Andrews, a medium secure hospital, and Elizabeth was allowed to visit. But after his conviction, he was moved to a high security prison to serve his whole life sentence.
He was able to cope at St Andrews, and that's a specific hospital, medium secure hospital. He had a lot of support there, but even there the staff didn't always understand what he was trying to say. He can hardly communicate. He's had a massive brain injury. You can imagine the bullet went there and up there. He was in a coma for so long. He had a stroke.
Elizabeth was initially not allowed to discuss the case with her son and has since chosen not to.
I've never discussed it with him. I think at that stage, and possibly even now, he can't remember because he did sustain such a huge injury, such a big brain injury. So a lot of his memory has gone. And then I took the view that actually whatever he went through in the past, it's in the past, and that's not something I can change, but I can be here for him. I don't want to talk about those things with him, and he doesn't want to talk about those things with me. It's my role with him really is more as his mum, to keep his spirits up.
Given his complex disabilities, Elizabeth became very worried about how her son was coping in a high-security prison.
I've had about 4 phone calls from him since he's in the last 3 months, and I've asked him things like, "Why haven't you telephoned previously?" And he says, "Too complicated." So he's got some set phrases which he uses. Too complicated, too confusing. I've asked him about washing his clothes because I heard from one of his legal visits that his clothes were dirty and that his hair was unkempt and that he was pointing to a sweet that was lying on the floor of the visiting room and asking the lawyer to go to the canteen and buy him some food. So I don't have the full picture of how he's coping in prison, but from my experience, he isn't coping.
The most serious thing, I think, is the issue of where he's currently being held. And given that he is, he's had this critical illness, a brain injury, he's had a stroke since this event, then I think the chances of him being a risk to anyone would be massively diminished. And his mother is fearful that he's currently in a place that isn't helpful and that he's not coping well with at all. So perhaps the time now is to think about where would be best or better suited moving forwards, and could he be considered such low risk now to warrant a place at a mid-security hospital, for instance.
As the mum of a convicted murderer, Elizabeth has had to face judgment from many people, including friends.
Some of them didn't know how to approach me. Some of them blamed me for the fact that he'd moved out and that I hadn't known where he was. And some of them were very supportive, took me out for coffee, invited me around, talked to me, prayed with me. The ones that haven't supported me, I've had to be careful because for my own mental well-being, because I obviously as a mum I'm thinking, could I have done things better? When Louis had moved out, I thought of going to his workplace. I decided against that. I thought that would just make it worse, that he'd be really upset and angry with me. So I was, you run through your mind the things that perhaps you could have done better. And I didn't want to face that being said by friends. There should also be an understanding that these things don't happen in a vacuum, that all offenders have families.
Elizabeth is hoping that attitudes towards autism are changing and that schools are becoming better equipped to diagnose and help these children.
There's not as much stigma now with autism as there was 20 years ago. And that's a huge leap forwards, but there's still a long way to go. What I saw from the CCTV upset me because I'd never seen Louis as an adult interacting with other adults. I'd only ever seen him in the family setting. So when I saw him being stopped and searched, they misinterpreted his lack of eye contact, the slowness of his speech, that they saw that as shiftiness and lying. So if anything, I would like more more awareness of what autism actually is.
At the inquest after the trial, the senior coroner found that there was a failure on the part of the arresting officer to carry out a safe, thorough and systematic search of Louis de Zoysa, that the cover officer failed to take steps to ensure an effective search was carried out, and that there was a failure on arrival at the custody centre to notice that one of Louis de Zoysa's hands was hidden. He was probably holding the gun. These are all tragic errors which ultimately led to Louis de Zoysa coming face to face with Sergeant Matt Ratana, armed with a loaded weapon. It's a heartbreaking case, which cost an innocent man his life and has left two families, those of Matt Ratana and Louis de Zoysa, devastated. Their lives will never be the same again. But it also raises vital questions about how we deal with autism in the UK and whether high security prison is the right place for a young man with physical and mental disabilities to be. Next time on Mums of Murderers.
You're through to the police. What's the location of your emergency?
I was stabbed.
Right, when's
Neighbour's
that?
husband and the mother.
We talked to Lynn Reeves from Somerset, whose son Colin, a former soldier, stabbed his neighbours Jennifer and Stephen Chappell to death while their children slept upstairs.
He says they're dead. They're dead. He stabbed them. He says they're dead. He had just gone into army mode. He was a trained killer. That is what they're trained to do. Why couldn't we see how he was suffering?
I shouldn't have done it. I've ruined their lives and mine. Can I just confirm, did you say that?
It's so hard for us to move on. I don't think we can move on.